Yo, what's up? And you're hanging with the big bad ugly beast on this really bleak and gray looking Sunday afternoon. I haven't even been outside yet, man. I wonder how the weather is. Woke up late in the cave because I went to bed late in the cave, and that's what happens when you go to bed late. You usually wake up late. How's everyone doing? It's been a little bit since the last two episodes, where I ranted and raved about Rolling Stone's bullshit reviews. And as you can hear, I stopped using music on my intro because I noticed that I was getting flagged a lot. Bullshit copyright and all that crap, whatever the hell. Like, these people need more money. Anyway, hope all is well. And today, doing something a little interesting, I consider it. Had this thought in mind for a while, speaking about all things 90s music. During that wonderful stretch of time from 1990 to 2000, we saw, other than a lot of new music being presented to us, we saw so many artists who were prominent and famous in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and had crossed over into the 90s and were still kicking ass. And I wanted to do an episode about a lot of those artists that in the 90s still found fame in a lot of the content that they were kicking out. And a lot of them just kept on kicking out so much content. And the wonderful thing about this period of time is that it gave these artists a little bit of a chance to reinvent themselves, not that they had to, but to attract a younger and different audience, because they were also competing or having to deal with the alternative grunge movement, metal, a lot of the punk music, and everything else in between as the times and music was changing. So therefore, it was a wonderful time for these musicians to put out stuff, and a lot of them put out music that were mega hits in the 90s. And that's what I think makes a lot of these artists so important, is that they were able to reinvent themselves, kind of show the world, no, I'm still here. Don't forget about me. And a lot of them are still going today, thank God, man. I think the groups the people we're gonna talk about are still going today. Some of these artists have been some of my favorite. I've discovered a lot more about them as time has gone on, and perhaps I didn't know too much about them in the 90s. And as everything else in music, that's the wonderful thing about music. You could hear a song tomorrow that came out in the 50s and you never knew about it. So, that's the real cool thing about music, is that it's kind of timeless, and there's always something being discovered by yourself or a group, or maybe it's lyrics that you didn't know about. So, you know like I said, apart from Nirvana, Stone Temple Pilots, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, the Smashing Pumpkins, Hole, and all the other wonderful bands of the 90s, there were so many of these people who had been around and had already solidified themselves in the music genre as megastars, whether they were parts of groups or doing solo stuff, either or. So let's start talking about some of these artists, if we will. One of them I got to start off with, man. He's been on my brain a little bit. I don't know why. I guess because I just saw that they're going on tour again, and he's going on tour again, I should say. And it's funny because I think he just turned 60. And in the 80s, I mean, this guy was just big is not the word. I tend to use this phrase so many times, but I think it's only because um it really helps me to kind of just you know gather everything for this one person and just talk about how big they were. I don't have a lot of the words. I don't have the words to kind of. I can't think of the words to kind of just think about how mega they were. I'm talking about John Bon Jovi. Now, listen, man. If you dig music the way I do, you got to give that man some ultra respect, because it's 2022. His shit is still slaying. and that dude has solidified himself as legit. And growing up, again in the '80s, you couldn't go anywhere without hearing his music. So we're talking about if we go back to the '80s, obviously the hits, "Runaway," obviously, "You Give Love a Bad Name," "Living on a Prayer," "Wanted Dead or Alive," "Never Say Goodbye," "Bad Medicine," "Born to Be My Baby," "I'll Be There for You." I mean, "Lay Your Hands on Me." The songs go on and on. When I think of the '80s, I think of Bon Jovi big time, man. I mean, you couldn't go anywhere without seeing his posters, seeing his pictures, his videos from the concerts and whatnot. In the '90s, he transferred over beautifully. Obviously, one of his, in my opinion, my favorite song by Bon Jovi was, and this was a solo work by him. Was not with his band. "Blaze of Glory" from the movie Young Guns 2, which I think is his best song by far. He actually appeared in that movie too, which is I think he's in the beginning of the movie. He's one of the outlaws who like kind of has Billy on the floor while he's asleep there. But yeah, I mean, I don't know how you can't dig him, man. There are people who just don't like certain people, and I get it, but that doesn't mean you can't respect them. You gotta respect him, man. That guy, again, has slayed since the '80s, '90s, 2000, on and on. It just keeps on going. Like I said, he's going back on tour, which is what I've never seen him live, but what I've heard is wonderful. And obviously, he's got big list of hits that they probably just rattle off one after another, man. In the '90s, of course, some of his hits, other than "Blaze of Glory," was "Keep the Faith." Okay, that was a huge song. "Bed of Roses," right? I think every chick likes that song, "Bed of Roses." "In These Arms," again, every chick likes that song. Uh, and then, of course, comes "Always" in 1994. Let me tell you something. I had a girlfriend in 1994 as a young punk teenager who was mad about that song, and she was really well versed in music and shit like that. And I remember going over her house, and that fucking video was always playing on MTV. It was that whole dramatic video with that actor. What was his name? Jack Noseworthy. Phenomenal name, by the way. Good actor too. He played the dude in that with the long hair and shit, and they had the whole thing going on. I don't know what the story was in the video, but I remember you couldn't go anywhere uh, without hearing that, man. It was everywhere. It was probably one of the biggest songs of the '90s. It was all over the friggin' charts, you know. So yeah, man, Bon Jovi kills. You got to respect the man. You have to respect the man when you talk about music. When you talk about guys who've lasted the lengths of time and are still kicking ass. You want to laugh? I had the pleasure of being at oh God, I think it was 2002. The New York Giants opened on a Thursday evening against the San Francisco 49ers. My 49ers, baby. My 49ers. And I think it was 2003, actually. I take it back. So Niners ended up winning the game, thank God. Thanks to Jeff Garcia and Terrell Owens. But at halftime, this is in the Meadowlands before it was called MetLife Stadium. Bon Jovi Bon Jovi sang at halftime, and I think he rattled off like 10 hits like it was nothing. And I know he was promoting "It's My Life." Kick ass, man! Standing ovation times 10. I'm sure there were a lot of people that didn't come for the game, came for him. They don't do that anymore, really, especially not with big stars like him. But yeah, he was one of the many I had to mention, man. He's been on my brain for a bit. I love to look back at or just look into certain artists and just study their discography and all the music that you put out, because you hear a song by them sometimes and you kind of just look back into their catalog and see all the things that they've done, whether it was writing or singing or whatever. And he's one of those guys, man. Again, huge in the '80s, still big in the '90s, and so on and so forth. So he was one of the guys I definitely had to talk about. I just I couldn't I couldn't not mention him in this list of in this list of people that we're talking about. Moving on from the great Bon Jovi, um, is someone I've always, well, not always, but I always, I did it again. I find interesting, man, on many levels. Whether I've seen him in movies, which is really where I started to discover him, or hear a lot of his music. Again, I got to kind of give thanks to my oldest brother Christian, who really brought a lot of this gentleman to me. Um, I knew jack shit about him, but obviously, I started to discover a lot more about him as time went on. Whether I heard the song in a movie or on the radio, sermon movies and whatnot. So that was always that was very interesting. Um, Talking about Iggy Pop, the great Iggy Pop. There's in music there are these artists who are combinations, I feel, of certain different artists, yet they're their own entity. So, for instance, when I made reference to Scott Weiland, I said Scott Weiland reminded me of a combination of Jim Morrison, David Bowie, Lou Reed, and Iggy Pop. Yet he was Scott Weiland. And to me, Iggy Pop reminded me a lot of David Bowie. Had a little bit of Lou Reed in him. Um, he was a wonderful combination. The way I think I kind of came upon him was definitely from the movies, and then not knowing that he was also a musician because he's been in a shitload of movies. You can see him in a small but great role in The Color of Money with Tom Cruise and Paul Newman, Martin Scorsese's. You could see him in that movie by Jim Jarmusch, Coffee and Cigarettes. He was in The Crow too, City of Angels. He had a pretty big role in that. So he's been in a lot of stuff. He's just a very interesting. I love watching his interviews. Early on, he was on another planet, bro. Like I don't know what he was doing, but he was funny as hell. Reading a lot about into him, he had unfortunate bouts with drugs and heroin, which he kicked, and he's always on stage shirtless. He had that great set of abs, man. If you ever heard an interview with him too, he has such a great voice. I could do a pretty decent impersonation of him, I think. He kind of talks like this. So we were doing stuff like that and was just kind of all over the fucking place. But that's the way it is. His voice kind of changed over time, man. Again, he was a guy who was around, obviously, in the late 70s. He had, his albums were The Idiot, Lust for Life, Kill City. He had his band, The Stooges, which broke up then. And then, of course, in the 80s, he had albums like Soldier, Party, Zombie Birdhouse, blah, 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 which was a really big album, Instinct. And then in the 90s, he reinvented himself with this album Brick by Brick, which I really have to give a hardcore listen to because some of my favorite musicians are on it. It's another thing that I really like that Iggy Pop does, or a lot of artists do. I give them a lot of credit when they work with such wonderful musicians. And just looking over the personnel on this album, you got Duff McKagan and Slash. I mean, what's better than that? Kate Pearson. So he works with a lot of great people, man. And I think that always means, for me at least, that means a lot because it shows that they really know their stuff and that they really care and they're experimenting and they're putting themselves out there. Yeah, Brick by Brick did really well on the charts and whatnot. And then of course he had the other album, American Caesar. It's got that real cool last picture of him on the front with his chest. He's all ripped up with the abs and whatnot. And again, just by looking over the personnel for this album, I'm some great people he worked with here. Larry Mullins from U2, the great Henry Rollins, and he had another album. His third of the '90s was Naughty Little Doggy. Great name for an album. That's that album with him on the cover with the army helmet. He's kind of like slumped down, looking kind of sad, and lot of hits off that album as well. Um, and again, just looking over, again looking over some of the personnel. He's always working with a lot of great musicians and whatnot. And again, I take that back. He was around since the '60s, actually, late '60s, 1969. Which, when you think about it, isn't too long. But when you think about it in terms of music, it seems like it was forever. Because it was, you know what it was? It was such a different time. But they weren't part of the prototypical '60s. In '99, he had another album released called Avenue B. Okay. Had some real interesting songs on it too, man. There's a song called No Shit, Nazi Girlfriend. Um, he did a lot of good covers too, to a lot of famous songs. Covered them really well too, man. Um, and again, this album's doing pretty well, man. Doing really well. And then, of course, into the 2000s, he's still releasing a lot of content, still going strong today. And again, it's amazing when you see that these musicians, when they reinvent themselves, and they're able to just shine at certain times, even if they've been around for a long time. It doesn't really matter. You know, they it's amazing combination. I don't know what it is of just like finding the right time. In 1998, his song "The Passenger" kind of it kind of resurfaced. It was released as a single in its own right in March of '98, but it was actually recorded and released on the album Lust for Life in 1977. Sometimes we see that too, that songs come back around. Makes me think of Bohemian Rhapsody from Queen, thanks to Wayne's World. Oh, and then of course, you know, he had. I'm just looking over his list of hits. He had a song, man, in that movie. What was it? Great movie called The Jacket. It's I don't. It's not his song, obviously. Uh, we have all the time in the world. Has that wonderful trumpet or horn in the background, but he's singing it. It's kick ass. The movie The Jacket. It's at the end of the movie. Phenomenal movie. Phenomenal movie, man. Yeah, we have all the time in the world. Um, it was actually off an album called Shaken and Stirred, the David Arnold James Bond project, because it was in a David. It wasn't in a James Bond movie, but yeah, I mean, he was a bad motherfucker, man. Iggy Pop, fucking dude, used to roll in glass, used to contort his body. Great shape, even today, man. And he has a very interesting story how he survived drug addiction. He survived um, living in a mental institution. He grew up in Detroit. I think his, I don't know, I'm not sure. I think his dad may have worked for Ford. I'm really not, I forgot. I did a lot of reading into him, but I also liked him as an actor. And more than that, I really enjoy him being interviewed because he's so interesting, man. He's just so interesting. Even today, he's like a real deal dude. Like, doesn't put on a facade. He is who he is. That's what I fucking love, man. I fucking love that shit. But yeah, man, had to cover Iggy Pop for sure. Going on from Iggy Pop, I'm going to go right into another gentleman who I already mentioned because I believe that him and Iggy Pop were very close. I think he even produced Iggy Pop's album, one of his albums. I'm talking about the great David Bowie. I mean, how could you not talk about the great David Bowie? Because in the '90s, he did what he always does. He reinvents himself. He's had that period in time where he's been these different various characters, where it was, it's Ziggy Stardust, or then he was, the Thin White Duke, and it's amazing how he was always able to kind of transcend into something else. I mean, you really have to delve deep into him and his category, his discography, and all his legacy, because he was more than he had a lot of different hats, man. He was a really good actor too. If you really want to see a phenomenal performance by him, other than the great Goblin King in Labyrinth, which is probably one of the most phenomenal movies ever made, one of his most phenomenal roles, and he has one of the most phenomenal songs in Dance Magic Dance. Check him out in where he played Nikolai Tesla in The Prestige. Christopher Nolan's The Prestige with Hugh Jackman and the great Christian Bale. He is phenomenal as Nikolai Tesla. It's almost eerie. He's so good, David Bowie. Um, but again, going back in the 60s and 70s is where, obviously the 60s is where, he got his start. Late 60s, and moved on. He was becoming all these different characters that he, I guess, kind of invented, or these different eras that he kind of went through, man. And it's funny because he was he really was almost like a separate entity in each of these eras. I mean, in 68 to 71, it was the Space Oddity thing. Then 72 to 7, in the 70s, it was the whole glam thing. And then it was the Thin White Duke. Uh, and on we went. In the 80s, the new romantic and pop era. In the 90s, he was kind of like, kind of badass, man. He was definitely badass in the 90s. And you sometimes you don't know how much someone has put out and been around, and all the hats they've worn as an artist, until you really examine them. And he's always been a really interesting guy, man. I mean, one of the greatest musicians of all time. The hits are forever. Whether it's the man who sold the world, Ziggy Stardust. I mean, Dream, Gene Genie, Space Oddity, uh, Starman. We could go on and on and on and on. But in the '90s, he was absolutely kicking ass, man. He had that great album, one of the great albums he had in the '90s. Earthling was where he's wearing that real badass British jacket there, and he also teamed up with Trent Reznor, and they combined for that song. I think it was called Americans, right? Or I'm Afraid of Americans, whatever the case may be. But it's an absolute phenomenal album. I remember my oldest brother Christian having that, like, probably the day before it came out. The psycho that he is. Yeah, I'm Afraid of Americans, and great album, man. The video is really cool too, because you got him. He's him and Trent Reznor in it. I think I don't know. All his albums kind of seem to have like a life of their own, something going on with that. Which is always really interesting, because when an album, or at least for his albums, like, he would become these different characters, which was always really interesting, and you can really put that on him all the way back into his career. And he became these interesting characters. And being changing of the times in the '90s, he was, obviously still huge, man. It's not like he had gone anywhere. Maybe the time had passed, but that's what I find interesting is these people find a way to stay relevant or to be better than they ever were. I never had the privilege of seeing him live, something I really would have loved to, unfortunately, but I heard he was amazing live, just as he was just as he was um in when you see him in videos and stuff like that, or when you listen to him. In the 90's, he had one, two, three, four, five albums. Black Tie, White Noise in 1993. Great name for an album, by the way, which uh, which did well. A lot. I think for the most part, everything he put out had always really had done great. Um, you know, he again, he's one of these gentlemen that put together a wonderful group of people working on an album. Like just from looking at some of the people he's got, Sterling Campbell. Let's see, Albie Shore, was that the rapper dude? Mick Ronson. So he always put together a really good album. You know, he's also producing albums at the same time. Again, a guy who really had many hats. The Buddha of Suburbia was also released in 1993. This was one of his albums. What a great name for an album, The Buddha of Suburbia. That's pretty interesting, man. I think it's always great when you have a real interesting name of an album that's kind of catching. It's definitely going to get your attention. I see on this album also he works with the great Lenny Kravitz on one song, which is awesome. Lenny Kravitz is pretty kick ass, man. Let's see what else Mr. Bowie had. I'm sorry, I said that. Outside was another one of his albums that he released in '95. And again, I think with every album he released, it always gained a lot of interest from people, man. I think you can delve deep into his work, and each album has its own lifespan, as most do, and you can really spend a lot of time on that, talking about that. Looking at some of the musicians he worked with on this album, the great Brian Eno, Sterling Campbell again, and like I said, he was producing his own work or being one of the many producers involved. That's what I love too, is how involved he was in so much of what he was doing. And then we talked about Earthling coming out, of course. After Earthling was the album called Hours in 1999. I never heard this album, to be honest. I have to go back and really pay close attention to it. It's amazing the amount of songs that he was able to put out. It always amazes me when an artist has such a wide variety of songs and they're able to spend so much time on creating something. But in the 90's, he reinvented himself, even all the way up to his unfortunate death. I think he's become one of those. He already was. He was. It's he's a really tough character to kind of just thumb down, because, like I said, being all those different entities, you can put him into so many different categories because he had so much talent to become these interesting characters that he portrayed on each album. And I just think that when you look at the man as a whole, he's was an extremely talented artist who, again, had a very interesting story. I don't know how many you guys are familiar with his life, but starting from a certain point, and then building up to become this monster of an artist that nobody can ever forget. And then, of course, going into producing and then going into films. I mean, he was a juggernaut, man. I love juggernauts. I just do. And I think that he really put things on the map in terms of not giving a fuck, man, and putting on a great stage show. Whether it was coming out with all these wonderful elaborate outfits and whatnot, and creating characters for the album, and having a different genre for each album. I mean, he's like right at the top of that list. So yeah, man, the great David Bowie. Go back and just go through that whole catalog of music, and you'll be there for hours, man. He was just awesome. Moving on from the great David Bowie, it's amazing that if I will say so myself, that the how I've gone from Iggy Pop to David Bowie, this next artist, kind of falls right into that category because he was really good friends with David Bowie. I'm not sure if he was friends with Iggy Pop. I'm sure they knew each other just from the scene. The great Lou Reed, man, the great late Lou Reed, who my oldest brother Christian, if we all have those that we hold up high. My Elvis is his Lou Reed. Okay, my Elvis and Johnny Cash is my brother's, you know, Lou Reed and Bob Dylan. And that's how I found out about Lou Reed, was through my oldest brother. I was never familiar with a lot of his work until later on. Obviously, though, growing up in the 90's, we all heard Marky Mark and the Funky Bunch's version of On the Wild Side. Little did I know that that was already, created by the great Velvet Underground, Lou Reed, the great John Cale, Nico, the whole Andy Warhol thing going on. Lou Reed is a fascinating musician. I really got deep into him thanks to my brother. I would say in the late 90's, early 2000s, I had the pleasure of seeing him live 4 or 5 times. Probably some of the best concerts I've ever seen in my life because, again, he was another guy. First of all, he was all things. This guy didn't give a motherfuck. He didn't give a flying fuck. That's what I love about him. Didn't give two fucking shits. When I think of like all things New York City, and I think of all things like, that are not the narrative, the status quo, I think of Lou Reed because he was just a singular entity that followed the beat of his own drum. And I think all these musicians that I've mentioned so far and will continue to have that. And I love that. I cling to that shit because that's how I live my life. I follow the beat to my own drum. Lou Reed was definitely that guy. Again, an extremely talented musician and an artist in all forms of the word art. Crossed over into some movies. Um, Love his interviews. If you watch his early interviews when he was, dyeing his hair blonde and he had the choker on, he is fucking hilarious. What does he say to that one guy? I'm a trashy blonde. I love the way he fucks with reporters too. He's very direct, no bullshit. Not a guy I'd want to fuck with, man. He had that don't fuck with me look. In fact, the first time I ever saw him, my brother and I and the great Anthony Rao, I forgot where we saw him, man. I think it was, I want to say the Bowery Ballroom. And there was I could be wrong with this, so don't quote me. There was a dude flashing the phone up at him who was standing in the front row. And I remember Lou Reed just looking at the guy saying, "Don't flash me. Don't flash me." And like the crowd kind of fucking like just went dead. And then he looked back at the words and then looked back at the guy and said, "When you flash me, I can't see what I'm doing. Don't do that." You could tell from the look, it was kind of like that stone cold, don't fuck with me look. So not a guy I would definitely want to piss off, man. But yeah, man, this is a dude, Velvet Underground, been around since for an extremely long time. Um, from the early 70's, I believe. Um, well, late 60's, if we're talking Velvet Underground. obviously the late '60s, they had. It's a funny thing about the Velvet Underground. They weren't together long, of course, but that album inspired so many people. I forgot how the famous saying goes with them. Everybody who listened to the Velvet Underground wanted to start a band. Um, I forgot exactly how it goes. I got it. My oldest brother knows exactly what it is, but I totally forgot. Of course, yeah, we got to go back to them. The Velvet Underground, Nico, 1967, White Light, White Heat, 1968. Um, you know that great cover of the Banana, 1967. So we're going back to then. That he's lived a couple different lives, man, in terms of music. In the '70s, okay, whole shitload of albums he releases, man. Whether it was Lou Reed in 1972, and then The Great Transformer, another phenomenal album, man. Produced by by David Bowie and Mick Ronson. Talk about the talent involved, right? And I think as a solo artist, man, Lou Reed fucking found so much fame and just absolutely slayed. Vicious, Perfect Day, Walk on the Wild Side, Satellite of Love. I mean, it's a absolute phenomenal album. And again, looking at the personnel, he's working with Mick Ronson and David Bowie, who appear on the album, whether it's lead guitar or backing vocals, what have you. That album really put him in the stratosphere as a singular entity. And then, of course, I was just listening to this album the other day. I really dedicated a lot of time to it, thanks to my oldest brother, Christian Berlin. Holy fuck, dude. Holy fuck. That album was fucking. I don't know. It's not a long album, man. There's only 6 songs on it, right? Berlin, Lady Day, Men of Good Fortune, which is one of my favorite songs by him of all time, has probably some of the greatest lyrics ever. Caroline says, How Do You Think It Feels? Another one of my favorite songs by him. Oh, Jim. Caroline's, I'm sorry, there's more than 6. There's about 10 songs. Caroline says, 2, The Kids, The Bed. The Bed is a phenomenal song. Very deep, man. Very deep. And Sad Song. A great album, man. And again, he works with so many wonderful artists on this album, such as Jack Bruce, Steve Winwood. You know, it's always interesting to see all these wonderful people that were involved in the making of this album. Um, and this is an album that really stands alone by itself as well. It's considered one of the 500 greatest albums of all times. And again, like the great David Bowie, his albums have a concept. This album is a tragic rock opera about a doomed couple, Jim and Caroline, that addresses themes of drug use, prostitution, depression, domestic violence, and suicide. Again, it's always interesting to see how a lot of his albums have he gives this intense thought behind it. You really have to appreciate that. And going forward from there in the '70s, Sally Can't Dance, Metal Machine Music, Coney Island Baby, Rock and Roll Heart, Street Hassle, The Bells. Into the '80s, some of the albums were Growing Up in Public, The Blue Mass, Legendary Hearts, New Sensations, Mistrial, and New York. I mean, listen, man, he again another musician who just the content is amazing. His library is amazing. And again, unfortunately, he has passed, but just a phenomenal artist to see live in concert. And then you go back and you think about how long these songs have been around, and how many places they've transcended. I mean, there was that commercial not too long ago, Perfect Day, right? His song was in there. Into the '90s. Let's talk '90s. He released an album called Songs for Drella, where he worked with the great John Cale. A couple of years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I had the privilege to go to the Brooklyn Academy of Music with my oldest brother Christian and Anthony, my buddy Anthony Rao. Kind of they're like a dynamic duo when it comes to music. Kind of feel like Chewbacca as to with Luke and Han Solo when I'm with them. We saw John Cale at the Brooklyn Academy of Music. It was phenomenal. He had this really great, I guess it was an orchestra where they performed all of the Velvet Underground music, and it was an absolute phenomenal night. But yeah, him and Lou Reed worked together on this album, and it's familiar. It's funny. I see just reading some of the songs. Small Town's a phenomenal song. Open House, Style It Takes, Work, Trouble with Class Assist, Starlight, Faces and Names, Images Slip Away. It wasn't me. I believe nobody but you. A Dream Forever Changed. Hello, it's me. Two great musicians working together, man. Yeah, check out a lot of John Cale's stuff if you haven't. My oldest brother is a John Cale psychopath. 1992, he releases an album, Magic and Loss, and like Bowie. He's also transcending through his looks. He had gone through all these different characters. Remember, like I said, in the late 60s, early 70s, he was kind of dyeing his hair. He had the choker. Then in the 80s, he developed a little bit more of a laid back look. In the 90s, it's always badass, though, whatever the case may be, though. It was always all things badass, I think. Um, let's see. Set the Twilight Reeling, which I think is a phenomenal name for an album, right? On that album, the great Fernando Sanders, the great guitar player, and also who appeared on a lot of his other albums after that. And Laurie Anderson, right, his wife, doing the backing vocals, of course, appear on that album. And then you've got, let's see, yeah, a lot of stuff going on in the 90s for him, man. Um, Again, a lot of those singles that came out in the 90s, sort of Damocles, What's Good, Adventure, New York City Man, Hooky Wookie, Perfect Day, uh, which they re-released, I think, in 1997, or released in 1997, I guess. I guess this was for it looks like it was some type of compilation thing going on with a whole bunch of other people. But Children in Need, I guess, was the was like a some type of organization that they were doing the music for, raising money for children, disadvantaged children in the UK. So yeah, man, Lou Reed, man, another guy able to cross over into different times and just do his thing. And like I said, he appeared in a couple of movies. I believe it was either Smoke or Blue in the Face. He appears in a really interesting movie that takes place with Harvey Keitel, who owns the smoke shop in Brooklyn, and this wide variety of wonderful characters that come in. Lou Reed's one, and I'm talking about his glasses and whatnot. I think he actually plays himself. But yeah, I couldn't not talk about him. And him, like I said, he always reminded me. He goes right into the same area, really, like with Iggy Pop and David Bowie. They're so similar, or there's something really interesting about all three of them. They kind of mirror each other to some extent. I feel, at least. Moving on from the great Lou Reed, of course, is somebody that again, we somebody who wore many hats. Unfortunately, passed away not too long ago, but wore so many hats. Whether it was with his band, whether it was with the Traveling Wilburys, whether it was as a solo artist, whether it was with a bunch of the other bands that he played along with, whether it was. He also stepped into acting in the movie The Postman with Kevin Costner. Tom Petty. How could you not mention Tom Petty? I think an underrated musician. And if you go back, of course, all the songs he had that go back to the '70s, American Girl, Don't Do Me Like That in 1979. You know, um, Don't Come Around Here No More in 1985. What a phenomenal album, by the way. Kind of plays off the whole Alice in Wonderland thing. Let's see. Refugee in 1986. Won't Back Down. Running Down a Dream. Free Fallin', probably one of his most famous and biggest songs in 1989. And then, of course, we cross over into the 90s. You're So Bad, right? Great song, man. Phenomenal song. Solo album. Uh, Everybody remembers Learning to Fly in 1991. Into the Great Wide Open. That is an absolute phenomenal album if you've never heard it. Into the Great Wide Open. Uh, this was a song by him and the Heartbreakers in 1991. Uh, just a just just great stuff, man. Coming from that album, had that great cover art to it, if you will. The obviously it looks like it's just like the song. It's Into the Great Wide Open. But off that album, of course, you got Learning to Fly, and it's just a really good album, man. They were a phenomenal band. Um, and again, he worked with some great personnel: Jeff Lynne, Roger McGuinn from the Byrds. Had a hand in working together on that album. So this is a guy again who lasted a long time, crossed over, and just always found a way to just kind of reinvent himself. All the way up into '93, probably one of his greatest songs of all time, "Mary Jane's Last Dance." I remember when that came out. Again, that was probably one of the greatest videos at the time, one of the most famous videos that MTV was playing, and you couldn't do it today with that video, right? He's dancing with a dead body, who's the great Kim Basinger. He works in a morgue, falls in love with this dead body, and he's dancing with her and shit like that. He brings home, puts on the TV for her. I mean, you couldn't do shit like that today, unfortunately, with all the bullshit that goes on. Uh, American Girl in 1994. You Don't Know How It Feels in 1994. Another great song. You Wrecked Me in 1995. Walls in 96. And on and on and on and on he goes. Okay. Again, he was absolutely slaying it, man. Absolutely slaying it. Like I said before, part of the Traveling Wilburys, of course, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. I mean, it's a shame to think that he's no longer with us. That was a shocking death. Also, Mudcrutch, right? The other band he played with. So yeah, and like I said before, he crossed over into movies a little bit. Um, yeah, man, definitely sucks that he passed. No, I don't think anyone saw that coming. And I still don't know exactly what the cause of death was. I know he had something wrong with his hip. He was going to get some type of hip replacement surgery or something like that. So I don't know. Whatever the case may be, the worst part about it is he's no longer with us. But in the 90s, Tom Petty, again, slaying it, killing. That's kind of where I discovered him again through my oldest brother. Um, Sometimes what you do is when you discover the person, you work backwards into their category. I like to see their large variety of music. And moving on from him, I'm going to move into probably one of music royalty, one of the greatest guitarists of all times, one of the greatest artists of all times, one of the most interesting human beings. I just heard a really cool interview with him, the great Keith Richards. Listen, you know, you can't talk about music without mentioning Keith Richards. It's just not right. It's almost religious. How dare you? It should be hearsay if you do. There is a book he wrote. I believe it's called Life or My Life, whatever the case may be. I went through that book. Oh man, probably in 2 weeks. It's one of the most phenomenal reads ever because he has one of the most phenomenal life stories. If you're familiar with him, um, I think he's about what now, 78 years old. So when you think about it, he's kind of lasted the test of time. What's that funny quote that the late great Robin Williams always said, that there's only two things that could survive a nuclear war. One of them were the cockroaches, and the other one was Keith Richards. Well, that's kind of correct. But again, from a guy who obviously everybody knows, has been playing with the Stones forever. Also, he was a songwriter, um, just like a guitar aficionado, really. Recorded with so many different artists in his time, whether it was Eric Clapton or all these other wonderful musicians. He worked with Tom Waits. He worked with him on a couple of the albums as well. It's really interesting to hear him speak, and he's kind of an icon, and it's so great that we still have him alive. They'll never die. Um, and obviously, he went into a lot of solo work as well. I mean, with the Rolling Stones alone, let's just talk about that. Of course, everybody knows one of the greatest rock bands of all time. I mean, easy, who just pumped out content left and right and is still doing it. Into the 90's, where they released Voodoo Lounge, which is probably a phenomenal album, one of the most phenomenal cover arts of all time. And then, of course, Bridges to Babylon. So, he was with the Stones, and then of course he had a second solo album in 1992, Main Offender, um, which had come after his first solo album in '88, Talk Is Cheap. And again, you really got to appreciate the fact that the longevity, and then of course all the areas that he's been able to cross over into. He had that great song off Main Offender, "Wicked as It Seems," and "Eileen" with the two single hits off that. Um, and of course, he eventually crossed over into acting, right? I mean, I know it wasn't in the '90's, but loved him in the Pirates of the Caribbean series where he played Jack's dad. So it's great that's the one thing everybody that I've mentioned so far have in common is they all kind of were very relevant in the '90's, and yet had this extended life before that and after. I mean, the only person that obviously, well, the two obviously they aren't with us anymore, Lou Reed and Tom Petty, who I mentioned. Well, they would still be going strong today, but these other gentlemen are still going strong today. But again, Keith Richards is an icon for all things, man. Pick up that book, Life, if you can. It's really, really interesting. Even if you're not a big Rolling Stones fan, I don't know why you wouldn't be. Something wrong with you if you're not. But it's just sometimes when you reflect back on what he's been part of is just absolutely amazing. Guys like him come along once in a lifetime, man, and are able to extend themselves to so many things and to survive all that he survived, right? It's like amazing. Love me some Keith Richards. Last gentleman I'm going to talk about today. Oh, what I could say about this guy. We got to do a whole episode on him because he's one of the most underrated, amazing musicians of all time, one of the most amazing artists of all time. He's a diamond in the rough. He's a gem. Again, thanks to my oldest brother, I became very familiar with him later on than I knew. The great Tom Waits. How can you not like Tom Waits? In the 90's, let's just go through this quick. He had three really good albums: Bone Machine, The Black Rider, and Mule Variations. Bone Machine, awesome album. Awesome album. Some of the songs off that, Earth Died Screaming. Oh, dude, you got to listen to that shit. You got to listen to that shit. Jesus Gonna Be Here, again, one of his greatest hits. Going Out West, one of his best songs. You can catch that in the great movie Fight Club when Brad Pitt and Edward Norton are walking into that bar to go into the basement to beat the shit out of each other. Um, Black Wings, I Don't Want to Grow Up, which was his version of he covered the Ramones song there. And again, off this album, think about some of the musicians he's playing with, right? Les Claypool, okay, Keith Richards. I mean, that's what I love the fact that he works with all these great musicians, and has such a wonderful hand in it. Puts so much emphasis into it. Um, Also, too, like Black Rider came out in 1993. This 12 studio album, and again, look at some of the songs that came off this November. He's got a phenomenal titles for his songs. I'll Shoot the Moon, Crossroads, which the lyrics are by the great William S. Burroughs. Okay, again, you really have to appreciate his another guy who every album kind of takes on a life of its own entity, and he transcends as well. Mu Variations in 1999 is a phenomenal album, absolutely kick-ass. Big in Japan, great song. Hold On, definitely one of the greatest songs of the 90s. There, when we do a greatest songs of the 90s thing, Hold On is there. Okay, when we do an extended list of some of the greatest songs, Hold On by far one of the best songs. A phenomenal video. What's he building? Listen to that song. It's not even like a song. It's more of like just him narrating something. Chocolate Jesus, one of my favorites, man. I could listen to that over and over. Come On Up to the House. It's funny, when I first got into him, I forgot the name of the album I was listening to, but it was Diamonds on My Windshield was the song I was caught on. I must have had hit repeat on that song about 60,000 times, because that's how much I was into it. What I found in Tom Waits is what I find in so many of the musicians that I love is this individuality, this individual person who produces and makes music that speaks to you personally. It's like, God put a person on earth that puts out stuff that is just for you. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's exactly how it feels. And obviously now, backtracking, he had, other than the 90s, I mean, this guy's had some extensive career. Check another guy who transcends, as I said, but check out Closing Time and Heart of Saturday Night, his first two albums, where it sounds very piano barish, very jazzy, and but phenomenal. And then, Nighthawks of the Dinah, Small Change, Foreign Affairs, Blue Valentine, Heart Attack, and Vine. As you cross over into the 80s, he really blows up. Swordfish Trombones is a phenomenal album. Rain Dogs, phenomenal album. Frank's Wild Years, and again, every album takes on a life of their own. Slew of great songs that come off of them. Into the 2000s, Alice, Blood Money, Real Gone, Bad As Me, which was his last album, which was absolutely phenomenal. And another great thing about him is so many of, think about so many of the singles he's had, In the Neighborhood, Downtown Train. No, that wasn't a Rod Stewart song. He wrote it first. Um, you know, on and on you go. On and on you go with the songs. Again, another guy who the content and the variety you could just keep on naming, and it just goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. He's had some phenomenal music videos too. In the Neighborhood's one of the best videos I've ever seen. Downtown Train is a phenomenal black and white video. Going Out West is really cool. I Don't Want to Grow Up is hysterical. It's directed by the great Jim Jarmusch. Like I said before, Hold On's a phenomenal music video. God's Away on Business. What a song. What a fucking album. Hell Broke Loose, one of my favorite songs he's ever made. Has another great album. And talk about for a second another guy who transcended over into movies. Um, you know him as Renfield from Bram Stoker's Dracula. He was absolutely phenomenal in that. That's probably how I discovered him, watching that movie over and over, never knowing that he was a wonderful musician. But he's been in so many other movies, Risk Cutters, or what is that movie, Seven Psychopaths, and Coffee and Cigarettes, the great Jim Jarmusch. So again, wow, it's just an absolute and utter artist of his own. Go watch his interviews from early to now. He was on Letterman so many times. He's such a phenomenal, interesting character. Love Tom Waits, man. I wish I could see him live in concert, but yeah, yeah. Well, that about does it. talking about today's episode again. Just talking about a lot of musicians who were prominent in the '90s, who had a huge and interesting musical life earlier on and then after. From time to time, what we'll do too is break down certain episodes about these musicians and their time in the '90s and focus on that. If you haven't already, please do me a favor and be kind enough to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Give it a thumbs up. Let me hear what you think, whether you like it, whether you don't, whether you want to tell me to go fuck myself or something. Not that I'm going to really give a shit what you think about that. But yeah, man, I'd love to hear your opinion on things. So be well. The beast is going back into his cave. Later.